The year 1848 was a year of revolution in Europe. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels published the Communist Manifesto, and the big cities of Europe, like Berlin, Paris, and Vienna, were marked by political demonstrations. But that same year, a minor revolution of a different sort was touched off in a small town in New England. This revolution was brought about by an unfortunate accident, but it provided a turning point in man's long and historical attempts to understand the relationship between consciousness and brain function. The accident occurred in September 1848 in a small town of Cavendish, Vermont. Phineas Gage, an energetic 25-year-old foreman, was working on the new line of the Rutland and Burlington Railroad. He was about to blast a rock by pouring gunpowder into a deep, narrow hole drilled in the stone. The powder in place, he rammed in a long iron rod to tamp down the charge before covering it with sand. But the tamping iron rubbed against the side of the shaft, and a spark ignited the power. The massive rod, 3.5 feet long, 1.25 inches in diameter, weighing 13 pounds, shot from the hole under the force of the explosion. This powerful missile struck Phineas Gage beneath his left eye and tore through his skull, departed from a hole in the top of his head, and finally landed 50 yards away. Well, believe it or not, that was not the end of Phineas Gage. At least not of the body that bore his name. After regaining consciousness, Phineas was able to speak. He rode on a cart to his room, climbed a long flight of stairs, and was finally attended some 2 hours later by his physician. Within a few weeks, his wounds had healed, and Phineas was eager to get out of bed. There could be no doubt that a large metal rod had passed completely through the part of his head that filled his forehead, yet his senses and speech were normal, and his memory was apparently unimpaired. By November, Phineas began to roam around town planning his new future. And here is the point of this curious tale. Phineas Gage had indeed a new future, because he had become a different man. The efficient, capable, and friendly, considerate Phineas was transformed, and in his place emerged a childlike phoenix with the strength of an ox and an evil temper to match it. Sir John Harlow, his attending physician, wrote of him, "The equilibrium between his intellectual faculties and animal propensities seemed to have been destroyed. He is now fitful, irreverent, indulging in the grossest profanity, impatient of restraint or advice when it conflicts with his desires. He is obstinate, capricious, and vacillating. His plans for future operations are no sooner arranged than they are abandoned. In short, he is no longer Phineas Gage." What Sir John Harlow was describing is the now well-recognized change in personality which often accompanies damage in the frontal lobes of the brain. News of the metamorphosis of Phineas Gage reached the ears of the medical world in the 1860s, and it served to provide the final missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. The emerging view was that different mental functions are localized in various parts of the tissue of the brain. But a long historical movement preceded the development of this view, which found its origin in man's attempt to understand the interaction between the mind and the body. One would have to agree that the mind-body, or rather the soul-body problem, found its most detailed expression in Greek philosophy. Alcmaeon of Croton, who was a Pythagorean, was the first Greek thinker to locate sensation and thought in the brain. He was the first to speak of passages leading from the sense organs to the brain. In so doing, he established a tradition to which the school of Hippocrates and, of course, Plato adheres, but not Aristotle. Aristotle adhered to the older tradition, which relegated the heart as the principal sensorium, the seat of consciousness and the guardian of the soul. Aristotle's idea is still with us, perhaps not as much in science as in art and poetry, where the heart and not the brain yearns and aches and finally breaks. But Plato most decidedly championed the brain as the seat of the soul. He did this not by dissecting and observing, but by relying on the power of thought and method of mathematics. Plato argued that the perfect geometrical shape is the sphere. Where else could the rational soul of man, or in Plato's words, the divinest part of us, be, but in the spherical head, the summit of the human body? The impact of Aristotle's and Plato's views on the mechanism of mentality was immense. This influence became even more pervasive with the help of early Christian fathers who sanctified and dogmatized their ideas as unquestionable truths and thus shackled the mind of men for centuries to come. Now, as early as the 11th century, the arrangement of the ventricles of the brain were interpreted by the Persian physician and writer Ibn Sina. It was known that the 4 ventricles consisted of 3 connected compartments, the front pair, the middle, and the last. Knowledge of this interconnected system allowed the medievalists to give concrete form to Plato's idea that the action of the mind proceeds through a series of operations from sensation to memory. The first pair of ventricles was thus said to be the site of sensory analysis. It was called sensus communis. Sorry, I've got the right other. That's the one. And it was connected to the nerve endings of the sense organs. This is shown on the left-hand side, the front channel, the front cavity. And as you can see, it's got its connections with the eyes, with the ears, and with the mouth. Images were supposed to be created here, and they were passed on to the middle ventricle, which was the seat of reason and judgment. The final step was memory, which was located within the last ventricle. This remarkable scheme persisted until the 17th century, when finally its truth was challenged by the 2 symbols of the Renaissance period, Leonardo da Vinci and René Descartes. Perhaps Leonardo's greatest contribution to modern science was the system of observation based on experimentation. Science comes by observation, not by authority, he said, and observe he did. Sometime between 1505 and 1507, he provided the society of his time with the first accurate drawing of the 4 ventricles of the brain. He performed a detailed dissection of the brain on an ox and injected molten wax into the ventricles. When the wax had set, he had himself made a cast of the ventricles. What Da Vinci saw in this cast forced him to revive the classical theory of serial processing in the brain. He noted that many nerves from the sense organs did not in fact arrive at the first pair of ventricles, but in the structure which was located around the middle ventricle, in the area within the organ that is now regarded as the thalamus. Although his illustrations were accurate, Leonardo didn't have the courage to make the conceptual leap and break away from the classical tradition, and he named the ventricles the classical names. But he did manage to break away from Plato's death grip, and he insisted on moving sensus communis to the middle ventricle. On the other hand, Descartes' contribution to modern science was not empirical, but it was conceptual. He made a radical distinction between the mind and the body. The mind he regarded as a machine. Descartes split the body and the mind, but as a devout Catholic, he was careful to provide an anatomical point of contact between the soul and the body. This he did in the pineal gland. On this slide, it's marked as H in the tear-shaped organ, which is situated in the back of the brain. Descartes was not really much of a precise illustrator. He tried to sort of represent the general form rather than the detail. And in here, as can be seen, the spiritual spirit is supposed to be emanating from that pineal gland marked H. And the spirit is supposed to flow from there into the cavities marked E, and from there on through this network of pores into the cavities A, and from there on to B, and it just descends down to the spinal column. The concept of dualism that Descartes pronounced became firmly entrenched in scientific philosophy, and it finally freed men, even devout men, to pursue experimentation on the material aspects of the mind without fear of treading in God's path. This is the view of Descartes of the brain when the ventricles are asleep. He proposed that the spiritual or the animal spirit which emanates from the pineal gland once again goes to sleep during sleep, and the ventricles as a result collapse, which you can see it's sort of not being highly inflated in the top view, and then the bottom view represents the view of the ventricles when the individual is awake, and the ventricles are seen to be quite tough and rigid. So it was this new scientific method and the new conceptual outlook that paved the way for the enormous advances that subsequent centuries were to witness in brain-behavior relationships. The first major breakthrough came about in 1863, when Pierre-Paul Broca, a French surgeon, reported post-mortem results on 8 of his patients who had suffered cerebral damage in the frontal lobes. He wrote, "Here are 8 instances in which the injury was in the posterior third of the third frontal convolution. This number seems to be sufficient to give strong presumptions, and the most remarkable thing is that in all the patients the injury was on the left side. I do not dare draw conclusions from this, and I await new facts." The conclusion that Broca did not dare to make is the one that is widely accepted today. That is, the mental mechanism for speech is nearly always localized on the left side of the brain, in the area of the brain tissue which is now commonly called Broca's area. With Broca's area damage, what speech remains is reduced to a curt telegraphic-style message. If damage is only restricted to Broca's area, then speech production suffers, and the patient's ability to understand speech remains intact. But somewhat later, in 1874, Carl Wernicke discovered that damage further back in the left cerebral hemisphere can cause a language loss of a different nature. This language loss is really in terms of understanding the spoken and the written word, but not a disturbance in speech production as such. This region of the brain, now known as Wernicke's area, lies close to the auditory cortex, which analyzes the sounds that we hear. In the majority of people, this region is anatomically larger on the left side than on the right, the case being so even in young newborn infants. One wonders if this anatomical asymmetry could be a material expression of the human child's innate ability to learn language. Around the same period, in the mid-19th century, the British neurologist Hewling Jackson discovered another continent in the brain. There had been speculation, even in the ancient times, that movement in one half of the body is controlled by the opposite half of the brain. Jackson was aware of this cross connection, and while working with his epileptic patients, he noticed that epileptic seizures started with uncontrollable movements in one part of the body, but always the same part. Since epileptic seizures are caused by irritation in the brain, Jackson related the region of injury to the part of the body where the fits began. He thus discovered what is now known as the motor cortex, which is shown here on the right. A strip of brain tissue on the side of the cerebral hemispheres, which represents the muscles on the opposite side of the body. Directly behind the motor cortex is a second strip that receives a map of the entire body surface from receptors in the skin, and this is shown on the left side. The interesting thing about these maps is that the sensitive areas of the body are most generously represented. For example, the face, the mouth, the thumb, the fingers occupy a tremendous area over the surface on the right as compared to the trunk, the legs, and the feet. This is also true of the sensory cortex. It is almost as if the shape of the body were drawn out on the surface of the brain. So it was that by late 19th century, much of the mechanism of the various senses and their representation in the brain were recognized. But what of memory, that aspect of mental functioning that according to medieval thought was represented in the fourth ventricle? Where is it represented? It is unfortunate that much of our information on memory function is provided by the tragic case of H.M. This patient, at the age of 27, underwent radical surgery in order to find relief from generalized seizures which did not respond to medication. In his case, the surgeon decided to remove the part of the brain that he thought was causing the epileptic seizures. This part is an evolutionary ancient part of the brain called the hippocampus, which lies tucked inside the temporal lobes on the cerebral hemispheres. I didn't have a very good slide of the hippocampus, but on this slide, the hippocampus would be above the cerebellum, and it would be tucked inside underneath the temporal lobe. Now, the hippocampus had been removed on one side in many other patients, but because H.M.'s attacks involved the whole of the brain, both hippocampi were destroyed. The tragic consequence of this radical surgery was the nightmare of eternal forgetfulness, because the hippocampus in man is crucially important in laying down or retrieving long-term memory. The portion of the brain that is supposedly controlling skilled motor movements is actually represented down at the lower portion of the slide in the cerebellum. For example, the diagram on the top illustrates H.M.'s attempt to draw that star, to draw in between the two lines of the star. This is a skilled motor movement, and this is something that he had learned from the very young ages. So this ability was not at all hampered by his surgery. But conscious memory is the thing that was in fact deteriorating very rapidly. As you can see, the graphs indicate that his number of errors decrease over time, so that from one day to the next he makes fewer and fewer errors in performing that task. The only problem is that he has no memory of the fact that he has performed that task. Consequently, H.M. lives in a world of his own, which is only a few seconds long. Everything sips from his mind like water through the sieve. Every moment has a terrible freshness. He never knows the day, the week, what year it is, or even his own age. A few years back, his favorite uncle passed away. But H.M. suffers the same grief anew each time that he is told of his uncle's death. His general intelligence is not at all reduced, and he is painfully aware of his own shortcomings. He apologizes constantly for the absence of his mind, saying, "I'm wondering, have I done or said anything amiss? You see, at this moment everything looks clear to me, but what happened just before? That is what worries me. It's like waking from a dream. I just don't remember. Every day is alone in itself, whatever enjoyment I've had and whatever sorrow I've had." But memory traces are found in other parts of the brain as well, particularly in the temporal lobe. The well-known Canadian neurosurgeon Wilder Penfield pioneered the technique of electrical stimulation of the surface of the brain. He stimulated the surface of the brain with a weak electric current in order to excite impulses in the cells. His patients were completely conscious during this electrical invasion of their minds. Only the scalp was locally anesthetized. When Penfield moved his stimulating electrodes to the temporal lobes and the hippocampus, the experiences of the patients were episodes of existence, plucked from the patient's previous life. The person would suddenly be transported into the past and would feel himself eavesdropping on a familiar scene. During one of Penfield's operations, the right temporal lobe of a young woman was exposed and electrically stimulated at the places marked with numbered tags. The woman was fully conscious and described her curious sensations. This is what she said. As the stimulating electrode touched the spot marked by tag number 11, she said, "I think I heard a mother calling her little boy somewhere. It seemed to be something that happened years ago in the neighborhood where I used to live." A moment later, the same spot was stimulated. "Yes," she said, "I have the same familiar sound. It seems to be a woman calling, the same lady." Then the electrode was moved to tag number 13. The woman said, "I hear voices. It's late at night, around a carnival somewhere. Some sort of traveling circus. I just saw lots of big wagons that they used to haul animals in." There can be little doubt that Penfield's electrodes were arousing activity in the hippocampus and the temporal lobe, jerking out distant and intimate memories. We have briefly reviewed some of the marvels and mysteries of the brain as revealed by the scientific method. Undoubtedly, these and many other findings have served to further our understanding of the tangible aspects of man's cerebral functions. This is what we know today of the various functions and how they are represented on the surface of the brain. While the scientific method has been chiefly responsible for these findings, it is also partly to be blamed for diverting our attention away from the non-tangible and the non-quantifiable processes of the mind. In the Bahá'í writings, Abdu'l-Baha has emphatically stated that in man, besides the 5 outer senses, which are agents of perception, 5 inner powers also exist. The outer powers perceive the world of existence, but the inner powers are spiritual. These are the powers of thought, imagination, comprehension, memory, and the common faculty, which communicates between the outward and the inward powers. The outer powers are driven by the animal spirit, which is common to both man and animal. But in contrast, the inner powers are driven by the human spirit, or the rational soul. In the words of Abdu'l-Baha, the rational soul embraces all beings, and as far as human ability permits, discovers the realities of things and becomes cognizant of their peculiarities and effects and of the qualities and properties of beings. So it appears that the scientific method has provided us with information about at least some of the processes involved in certain of these inward spiritual powers. For example, at a neuronal level, science still doesn't fully comprehend memory, how it is formed, how it becomes represented, and how it becomes stored. Similarly, science has not yet solved the neurochemical basis of memory function. But elementary knowledge does exist with respect to the structures and areas which are involved in laying down and retrieving long-term memory. In the same way, some aspects of imagination, such as visual and auditory imagery and their cerebral representations, are now known. But the picture is certainly far from being complete. But even if all of these aspects of the 5 inward powers were known and empirically testable, we would still not be in a position to comprehend the workings of the rational soul. For Abdul-Baha states that the human spirit, unless assisted by the spirit of faith, does not become acquainted with the divine secrets and the heavenly realities. It is like a mirror which, although clear, polished and brilliant, is still in need of light. Until a ray of the sun reflects upon it, it cannot discover the heavenly secrets. And then we have the problem of the mind. In Abdul-Baha's words, the mind is the power of the human spirit. Spirit is the lamp, mind is the light which shines from the lamp. Mind is the perfection of the spirit, and is its essential quality, as the sun's rays are the essential necessity of the sun. How can science begin to comprehend the mind as the power of the human spirit if it does not even acknowledge the existence of the rational soul? Can existence only be verified through the senses? Then cosmic radiation can be said to be non-existent, since in itself it is not felt by the senses, though its signs and effects obviously are. It appears then that the scientific method has been invaluable in providing information on the tangible, the measurable, and the observable aspects of the mind. But to fully comprehend man's mind and soul, we need a new systematic method of discovery that can withstand the uncertainty of intangible phenomena and can affirm their existence on the basis of signs and effects rather than the senses. Not only is it impossible, but it is also inappropriate to use the present scientific method in order to experimentally study the relationship between the mind and the soul. The futility of this attempt is best represented by this illustration done in 1543 by Andreas Vesalius, the greatest anatomist of all time. Its title reads, "A Skeleton Contemplates a Skull."